Hello and welcome to part 3 of our A-level psychology exam feedback training from June 2022, focusing on paper 3 this time. My name's Tim Lawrence. I'm the Edexcel AL Psychology subject advisor, and this is a recorded version of the training that we delivered live in November, but with some additional feedback and clarification from our senior examiners based on the questions we received in the live event. So hopefully something for everyone. You can download the student responses that we'll be looking at in the description of this video, along with those for the other training, and find links to the other videos if you've not already watched those. So once again, we have focused on extended response questions. In response to feedback that we've had from teachers, we'll be looking at 3 different questions in this training and practicing applying the mark scheme and looking at the justification for the decisions that examiners took in awarding the marks. This training has been written by Sandeep Gill, one of our senior examiners, and the questions are a 16 marker, 12 marker and 20 marker taken from paper 3. So these highlights taken from the introduction to the examiner's report for paper 3 last summer show some areas of research methods that students found difficult. Also a recurring theme really, which is that applying their knowledge to scenarios given in questions is something that many students could do with practicing. Questions 4 and 5 and 6 we'll be looking at in detail in a second. Question 3, which was a challenging question on this paper, was a 6 marker that required them to apply theory to experimental results that they were given, and we'll come back to that in some future training. Question 5 was quite a difficult one because it was a question with quite a lot of application in it, and we'll be looking at that in detail shortly. So our first question is this 16 marker, and important for students to be aware that 16 markers will always be 6 marks of AO1 and 10 marks of AO3. So whereas the mark scheme will always talk about a balanced conclusion, showing awareness of competing arguments, actually examiners' reports talk about the need for an imbalanced response in terms of AO1 versus AO3, and the mark scheme makes clear that they should write more AO3 than AO1. Here the AO1 can be either knowledge and understanding of the studies themselves generally, or knowledge and understanding of the ethical issues. So here's the first half of this response. It's a rather long one, and it started with an introduction which I'd like to highlight here. There's nothing really wrong with it, but it's not necessary. It's not specific to the 2 studies. It contains a sentence about animal related ethical issues, which is definitely not relevant to this question. And I'm going to make an assumption that this candidate probably ran out of time for other responses on this paper, and they could have saved some time by just omitting that completely and going straight in here with some good AO1 relevant information about Sharif. And a good thing about this answer is that it has been quite selective. It's not provided unnecessary details about studies. One of the things I said during our live feedback training back in November was that it was generally a good idea for students to focus on the findings of studies and not give unnecessary detail on procedures. A really good question that was asked was for a question that's about ethical issues, are procedures not more relevant than findings? And yes, absolutely. In this case, it's the elements of the procedures which raise ethical concerns, which the student should be focusing on, and this is what they've done in fact in this case. They elaborate on this. So for example, a good way to start this second sentence, some more AO1 detail follows there, and then this is significant as it means is a nice way to then highlight that they're moving into some evaluation, and so we have some AO3 content. However, here we have the introduction of a competing argument. So this is a good example of where the candidate shows that there are arguments on both sides regarding the ethical status or not of this particular study. We've got more AO1 knowledge and an evaluation of it. So issues of consent and right to withdraw presented as ethical strengths. An interesting question that was raised during the live training. One teacher said, I've been told previously that that ethical issues must always be ethical problems, and you can't put forward ethical strengths. So we checked this with our senior examiners, and their response was, well, it absolutely depends on the question, and ethical strengths definitely can be credit-worthy. In this case, what we're looking for is a balanced discussion, looking at arguments on both sides, those competing arguments again, regarding the ethical issues in these studies. So considering the extent to which ethical issues are a problem, which guidelines are they on the right side of, which are they on the wrong side of, is really what's being looked for. This is a weak argument. I think this is quite a useful little sentence starter as well, because we're seeing the student here putting a value judgment on the strength of an argument. What follows, though, has been picked out by our examiner who wrote this training as showing a bit of a misunderstanding, because according to ethical guidelines, they only needed consent from the parents, as these young people, the participants, were children. And so it's perhaps not fair quite to be presenting this as a problem for the study, because they didn't have consent from the actual participants themselves. Moving on to Watson and Rayner, again we've got some good evaluative kind of openings here. This is significant, as it would mean that, and this makes the study ethical, as it means that, again, explaining the significance of the AO1 content that's been presented. And here is the final part of that response. And again, we've got a mixture of AO1 and AO3 content here. Again, we have evaluation of the strength of arguments. This is a strong argument, as it demonstrates that. Overall, Watson and Rayner were ethical because, and so we've got a good awareness of competing arguments evident here, and sort of mini conclusions being made. Perhaps a little bit of a lack of kind of sophistication here in deciding that overall it's an ethical study, because there's quite significant issues that have been been raised. And then finally we come back to Sharif. Again, supported judgments being made. The final thing I'd just like to pick up here is that there's a concluding paragraph at the end, which I'm pretty sure does nothing other than repeat previously made judgments. So I think this candidate's perhaps been advised that they should always finish with a concluding paragraph. They don't need to, providing they have reached many conclusions and justified those along the way. So again, in this case, they could have saved some time. When you put that introduction and that conclusion together, we've got almost a side of writing there that they could have spent on another response. So pause if you would like to reach your own judgment and haven't already before I explain the examiners. Right, so this was judged to be accurate and thorough knowledge and understanding, not at the top of this mark band, because there could have been some more detail and precision shown, for example, around that issue of informed consent having been obtained from the parents and therefore not required from the participants themselves. However, there's enough here for thorough, accurate knowledge and understanding. The evaluation also judged to be level 4, perhaps not quite as strong as the AO1. However, these chains of reasoning are logical, and there is an awareness of competing arguments, and these conclusions are sufficiently balanced to make it into level 4. So overall judgment then, if both AO1 and AO3 are level 4, then so is the overall essay. But as they were both towards the bottom of the band, especially the AO3, the final judgment is 14 out of 16. So our next question is number 5 on paper 3, evaluate the extent to which. A really good question that we've been asked is, what's the difference between a straightforward evaluate question and evaluate the extent to which? So this wording has been used for this question on paper 3 several times now, in each case for a question that is asking for application AO2 to a scenario and discussing how well a particular theory or approach in psychology explains the behavior in the context. So when you look at the mark scheme, the differences are minimal between what's in the levels for evaluate and evaluate the extent to which. But the extent to which just really means that you're discussing how well the explanation works. So rather heavily annotated, but hopefully you can just about make out the scenario on the left there about some young people and learning to drive. So pause if you want to have a quick read of this before I start giving feedback. So we come in straight away here with some relevant AO1 knowledge, and then it's applied to J here. And I think a good approach for this candidate to have taken is to interleave this AO1 and AO2, as you'll see they do throughout the answer, and there's some good AO2 applying it to J. So here are the second and third pages of their response. Again, it's rather long, this, but I think this is probably a student who writes fairly quickly by the looks. And they continue to give some AO2 at the top here, and then supporting evidence for this comes from is a good little phrase to flag that we're moving into AO3. And the strong responses to this style of question will give an equal weighting to AO1, AO2 and AO3. So that's an important thing to talk about when it comes to those application 12 markers. Unlike a 20 marker with that application. So for the 20 marker, there will still only be 4 marks of AO2 if there's a context, but 8 marks each of AO1 and AO3. So that's worth stressing to students. And in the comment description, below this video, you'll find a link to download a 1-page guide to different extended response questions in Edexcel AL Psychology with a bit more guidance aimed at students for how those mark breakdowns work. Moving on here, we've got some other evidence, and this was picked out by the examiner as a good example of the kind of strong AO2 that is showing an ability to really think about how ideas in psychology might link to the context. So a good link is made between aggressive and competitive behavior and J's driving. Again, we have supporting evidence being flagged as we move on to some AO3 over here. And an awareness of competing arguments with however, and here we have an explanation that diathesis stress and other factors might be involved. I've highlighted this in pink because examiner's feedback was that here there's less clarity and detail, and so it's a good thing to do to have introduced a competing argument, but that's a less strong element of the response there. And here's the final page of this answer to question 5. It begins with a new bit of AO1 content, so evolutionary explanations, quite related to what's gone before, but there's some new AO1 here. This explains that and a very brief outline of what the theory is for AO1. This can explain why J would do something. So there's the start of the AO2, and supporting evidence comes from. So there's the start of the AO3. So again, there's a clear structure and good use of these kind of phrases, which kind of explain what the answer is doing. Again, we've got awareness of competing arguments coming in here with the identification of an issue with this approach, which is to do with the lack of empirical testability for the evolutionary approach. I'll give you a second to pause if you would like to think about this before I go through the judgments of the examiner. So this answer had quite a good quantity of AO1, but it was judged to lack a bit of the kind of technical detail and precision needed for level 4. So that's kind of good level 3 accurate knowledge and understanding. The AO2 is a strength of this answer, and that was judged to be like a really good example of what's being looked for in terms of lines of argument, sustained application. It was very focused on J, but there was enough of it there linked to plenty of different ideas relating to the approach in question, such that that was deemed to be level 4 application. And then the evaluation, again, there was a good range of ideas there, but that lacked a bit of the depth necessary for level 4. However, it did show a grasp of competing arguments, just perhaps without that balance and detail. So on to the overall judgment on the mark. There's a summary of the AOs. Now that looks a bit like level 3, but in fact, because the AO1 and AO3 were both judged to be kind of good level 3s, and the AO2 was clearly level 4, that was judged to be level 4 overall, but at the bottom of that level, so 10 out of 12 marks. So our final question is the 20 marker assess question. It's looking for AO1 and AO3 imbalanced in the sense that AO3 should have greater focus in the answer, 8 marks for AO1, 12 for AO3. AO1 here is looking for knowledge and understanding of socially sensitive research, including psychological theories, studies and methods, whereas AO3 is for analysis, interpretation and evaluation of socially sensitive research using content from psychology, looking at implications, leading to judgments and conclusions of how far research could be considered socially sensitive. So assess, very similar to evaluate, but a bit like the to what extent questions, assess in the mark scheme for AO3 is looking for a judgment or decision being reached, balanced in the sense that it should show awareness of competing arguments, but more of a sort of conclusion, of a decision conclusion being drawn than for an evaluate question. So this response begins with an introductory paragraph defining the debate. This isn't necessary, but it does gain AO1 credit here, and it actually is quite a helpful approach. So you may well want to advise your students to do so, but in a fairly brief way as done here. And I think in contrast to previous response where I advised against including the kind of introduction that the candidate started with, this answer isn't that long considering it's a 20 marker, and they've been quite concise there in summing up the debate at the beginning. They then go on to give some relevant AO1 content regarding the RAIN research. I'd just like to pick out a nice kind of little linking phrase here explaining why that is socially sensitive. This may further lead to discussing implications of that, extending the evaluation for more AO3, and then showing awareness of a competing argument here, another good example, and actually showing quite a kind of subtle appreciation of kind of complex arguments and counter arguments there. So if you've not yet read this by downloading the response, you might want to pause and read, but I will just point out for this slide that this candidate's response is a good example of quite concise AO1 being introduced that is relevant to socially sensitive research, and then more extensive AO3 evaluation and clear logical assessments being made. So if you're looking for an example of what an assess question is looking for, then what this candidate is doing in their evaluation is that this is a strong assessment. Final part of the answer, and again there is a concluding paragraph. What's really important here, as we've said in about several responses, is not that there is a final conclusion, but that conclusions have been drawn throughout, assessments have been made. It's worthwhile, I think, this short final statement, but the best thing about it is that it's short and that the candidate hasn't kind of wasted time repeating extensively ideas that they've already explained. I won't highlight anything on this stage, but I will just draw your attention to the AO3 terminology. If you're deciding between level 4 and level 5, it's that full understanding and awareness of significance of competing arguments. So not just that they consider competing arguments, but there's a full consideration of how significant those arguments are, which is what then allows them to produce a judgment, which is balanced in that it takes account of all those arguments, but really draws a conclusion based on the assessment of how significant the arguments are. So finally, to the judgments of the examiner when marking this 20 marker, the AO1 was judged to be level 5, as was the AO3. So it's clearly a level 5 answer overall, and actually this was judged to be right at the top of that level and was awarded full marks, 20 out of 20. Thank you very much for watching. That's the end of our exam feedback on summer 2022 A-level psychology exams. Here and in the description of this video below, you can find links to ask us questions and sign up for monthly newsletters and generally get in touch. Thank you.